Teenagers have always had it rough. But in the medieval world, growing up was not just about finding yourself. It was about surviving long enough to do it. The rules were different and the expectations were high. If you are picturing medieval teenagers lounging around in grand stone castles, prepare to have your dreams shattered. The reality of medieval housing was far less glamorous. For the vast majority, home was a one-room wooden structure with walls made of wattle and daub, basically mud mixed with sticks and straw. Archaeological findings from medieval London show that the average home was roughly 400 square feet. Now imagine sharing that space with your parents, siblings, and sometimes even livestock. Cozy does not begin to cover it. Speaking of cozy, let's discuss sleeping arrangements. The scene in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where all four grandparents share one bed, was actually pretty accurate for medieval times. Minus the chocolate factory part, obviously. Most families shared a single bed platform, and by platform, I mean a slightly raised wooden surface covered with straw. The lucky ones had a wool-stuffed mattress, while others made do with just the straw. And yes, that included teenagers who slept right alongside their parents and siblings. Privacy was not even a concept in the 14th century, as some houses had as many as 8 people living in that single room. The room and board situation was quite literal. Many teens slept on actual boards, and recent analysis of medieval skeletons shows that many people developed early arthritis from sleeping on such hard surfaces. Teenagers did not have their own space to slam doors or blast music. The closest thing to privacy was probably hiding behind the family cow, if you were fortunate enough to have one inside your house. Medieval homes were essentially an all-you-can-eat buffet for rodents. There were numerous complaints about rat infestations, and some households even kept special sticks by their beds to swat at nighttime visitors. Teenagers were often tasked with rat-catching duty, which might explain why cats became such popular pets. The heating system was basically a fire pit in the middle of the room, with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof, or at least trying to. Most of it just hung around inside, turning everything and everyone into various shades of gray. And archaeological evidence shows that many medieval teens suffered from respiratory problems as a result. Windows were just holes in the walls, usually covered with wooden shutters, or, if you were wealthy, translucent animal horn. Glass windows were so expensive that some nobles would actually take their windows with them when they moved houses. One lord spent more on a single glass window than he did on a year's worth of bread for his entire household. The floor was typically packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes for warmth. These rushes would stay there for months, collecting bits of food, dirt, and things we would rather not think about. There was a complaint where a neighbor accused another of not changing their rushes for an entire year, leading to an unbearable stench that affected the whole street. Water was another daily challenge, and some people had to walk up to half a mile each way just to get it. No running water unless you count running to get it. As for the bathroom, most houses had a designated corner or a pot, while more sophisticated homes might have had an outdoor privy, which some towns required be built at least 2 feet away from your neighbor's house. As dawn broke, the rooster's crow meant it was time for medieval teenagers to get moving. While modern teens might grumble about taking out the trash, medieval adolescents were already halfway through their morning chores. In farming families, the day kicked off with milking lots of it. Records from a 14th century English dairy farm show that a single teenage worker could milk up to 12 cows twice daily. But dairy duty was just the warm-up act. Field work was where things got serious. A discovered wage record from 1374 shows that teenage workers were expected to plow an acre of land per day, roughly the size of a modern football field, using wooden plows and stubborn oxen. No tractors, no power steering, just pure teenage muscle, and probably a lot of creative medieval cursing. Ha! The decuhuold. Actually, dieses Warde Divinsquards. The work was not any easier for city teens. As apprentices, they would wake up at dawn in their master's house, where they lived for around 7 years. An apprenticeship contract from York listed the daily duties of a 14-year-old blacksmith's apprentice. Stoke the forge before sunrise, hammer metal all day, clean the workshop, and tend to his master's horses. In return, he got room, board, and the occasional clip round the ear if he messed up. The stakes were surprisingly high. Legally, boys as young as 12 could be fined for botching their work. One unfortunate teenage baker's apprentice had to pay a week's wages for burning a batch of bread, a costly cooking lesson indeed. Girls were not lounging around either. Spinning wool was a never-ending task that many started learning from age 6. By their teens, they were expected to spin enough wool for the entire household's clothing, with a skilled teen spinner producing about 2,400 feet of yarn per day. That is nearly half a mile of medieval thread. Household chores took on a whole new meaning. They prepared meals from scratch, starting with grinding enough grain each morning to feed a family of 6. Laundry day was particularly grueling. Without running water, teens had to haul water from wells or rivers, heat it over fires they built themselves, and then scrub clothes with homemade lye soap that could take the skin off your hands. A single laundry day could use up to 50 gallons of water. Childcare was another major responsibility. By age 13, many girls were practically running the household's nursery. Medieval records show families often had 6 to 8 children, with the older teens responsible for the younger ones. One account from a 15th century household book mentions a 15-year-old girl managing 4 younger siblings while her mother worked in the fields. For teens working as servants in wealthy households, the duties were endless, including cleaning chambers, serving food, caring for their master's clothing, and even cutting their employer's meat at meals. Their contracts specifically stated they must be swift of foot and ready of limb, medieval speak for no slacking off. The work was not just physically demanding, it was legally binding. Employment records from the 1300s show that teenagers could be taken to court for slacking off or running away. One 14-year-old boy in Canterbury was fined 3 days' wages for taking an unauthorized nap during work hours. For slextestigu versus near foreign tea. Some jobs did come with perks, though. Apprentice cooks often got extra food, and young servants in noble houses sometimes received hand-me-down clothing. One lucky teenage apprentice in London inherited his master's business after proving himself particularly skilled. Street vendors were often young teens selling everything from pies to shoelaces, and they developed quite the reputation for creative sales pitches. Medieval authorities actually passed laws limiting how loudly they could shout about their wares. The physical toll of all this labor showed up in medieval skeletons. Many teenage remains show early onset arthritis and worn-down joints. But all this hard work bred a certain kind of toughness. Those calloused hands from farm work and trade labor came in handy when disputes needed settling. Medieval teens did not just post angry comments online. They threw actual punches, and court records prove they were pretty good at it. A brawl between 2 teenage apprentices started because one claimed his master's bread was better than the other's, and both ended up in the stocks. These were not just random scuffles. Medieval towns had their own teen gangs with territories and reputation. In 1345, Norwich officials complained about a group calling themselves the Lads of St. Augustine's, who controlled an entire street, their biggest crime being throwing rotten vegetables at anyone wearing fancy clothes. The real action happened at festivals and fairs, where teenage brawls were common. One memorable case involved 30 teenagers fighting over who would lead the harvest dance. The winner got a black eye and the honor of choosing his dance partner first. Romance was not dead. It just had a few bruises. For noble boys, fighting was literally part of their education. Military training started around age 7 with wooden swords, and by 14 they were practicing with real weapons. A training manual shows exercises for teenage squires, including one charming instruction. When struck, strike back harder. But mind your master's son, he bruises easily. The road to knighthood was brutal. Tournament training was particularly intense. Mock battles called brawls let teens practice fighting in groups, like a medieval mosh pit with more armor and fewer band t-shirts. Records show these could get pretty heated, with one squire losing 2 teeth during practice and jumping right back in after spitting them out. When real wars broke out, teenagers found themselves on actual battlefields. During the 100 Years' War, soldiers as young as 15 fought alongside adults. One French chronicle mentions a 16-year-old squire who captured 3 English soldiers. Peasant teens were not left out. When raiders threatened their villages, farm tools became weapons, with pitchforks and scythes proving surprisingly effective. A manor court roll praises 5 teenage farmhands who defended their village, using only harvesting tools and remarkable aim with horse manure. Town defense was serious business. Many cities required teenagers to practice archery every Sunday, and English law actually banned other sports on that day to ensure young people focused on their bow skills. One town's records show they handed out free beer to the best young archers. Girls were not exactly sitting on the sidelines either. While not typically trained for combat, they learned self-defense. In 1401, a teenage girl successfully fought off 2 would-be robbers with a cooking spit. During sieges, teens living in castles would help man the walls, throw rocks and run messages. One castle's account book lists payments to 3 teenage messengers who snuck through enemy lines by pretending to be simple shepherds, complete with borrowed sheep. Strangely, several military manuals mention using squires' cracking voices to confuse enemy troops about defender numbers. All that fighting worked up quite an appetite, and medieval teens also had to make sure they looked sharp. However, their fashion choices were not just about looking good. They were bound by sumptuary laws. Break these laws and you could end up paying real fines or spending time in the stocks. For most young people, clothing was pretty basic. The average teen owned maybe 2 outfits, one for everyday wear and one for special occasions like church or festivals. These outfits were made of rough wool or linen, dyed in whatever colors their families could afford. Usually browns, grays, or a particularly unflattering yellowish green from onion skins. Young people would add creative patches to their clothes, not just to cover holes but to make patterns, and even trade small pieces of colorful fabric to enhance their outfits. The world of medieval accessories was surprisingly complex. Belts were a huge deal, not just for holding up clothes, but for showing off status. Teens from merchant families might save up for months to buy a decorative belt buckle, while noble teens might have belts adorned with silver or even gold. For noble teens, things were different but not necessarily better. Sure, they wore fancier materials. But they also dealt with seriously uncomfortable trends like heavy headdresses or pointy shoes called poulaines, some so long they had to be tied to the knees just to walk. The color of your clothing was a language of its own. Wearing certain colors could get you in trouble if you were not from the right social class. A 15-year-old merchant's son was once fined for wearing a shade of blue that was considered too royal for his station. Dyeing clothes was an art form, and apprentices learned complex recipes. Red came from madder root, blue from woad, and the most expensive purple from thousands of tiny sea snails. Clever teens found ways around restrictions, like layering fabrics to create the illusion of more expensive colors. Headwear was another big deal. Boys wore caps depending on their trade, while girls had to cover their hair once they reached a certain age. Many found creative ways to make their head coverings more fashionable by embroidering the edges or adding small decorative pins. Even shoes told a story. Most teens wore simple leather shoes, but the style and quality varied hugely. A farmer's son might wear basic ankle boots, while a merchant's daughter might have shoes with decorative cutouts. Looking good was not just about clothes. Medieval teens had their own ways of staying clean, though their methods might raise a few eyebrows today. Heating water was a massive chore, so most teens used a method called spot washing, using a damp cloth on visible parts like their face and hands. For dental hygiene, they would chew on fresh herbs like mint or rosemary, scrub their teeth with rough linen cloth, and use frayed twigs as primitive toothbrushes. A popular recipe recommended a paste of ground sage, salt, and vinegar. Hair care was an adventure involving herb-infused vinegar rinses to fight off lice, a constant battle. To deal with body odor, teens carried sachets of dried herbs or rubbed mint leaves directly on their skin as a medieval deodorant. Marriage in medieval times was not just about love. It was about land, money, and family connections. Parents started planning their children's marriages when they were barely old enough to walk. By age 12, most girls already knew who they would end up with, whether they liked it or not, while boys had until about 14 before their futures were sealed. One grumpy medieval father wrote in his diary, "My daughter claims she's too young to marry at 13. I was promised to her mother at 3. But medieval teens were not entirely powerless. They found creative ways to meet their crushes, like the 15-year-old girl who exchanged love notes hidden in loaves of bread she was delivering, or the couple who met secretly during church services. The church played a huge role in medieval dating. While parents could arrange marriages, the church insisted that both parties had to agree for it to be valid. This led to some dramatic scenes, with records showing teens speaking up during their own wedding ceremonies to declare they had been forced into it. The courtship process itself was surprisingly structured. Noble teens had to have a chaperone present at all times, leading to creative methods like the bundling board, a wooden plank placed between a courting couple in bed, allowing them to talk all night without touching. For common folks, courtship was more relaxed. Village festivals were prime meeting opportunities, though dancing often had restrictions, like only holding hands through handkerchiefs. The age gap in medieval marriages could be shocking. Girls as young as 12 could be married to men in their 30s or 40s, though many of these marriages were not officially completed until the girl turned 14 or 15. Some clever teens used this waiting period to their advantage, finding ways to break off unwanted engagements. Love matches did happen. Young people often found ways to influence their parents' choices, sometimes by deliberately running into their preferred partner at social events to create gossip that would force their families to consider them as a match. The concept of the dowry added another layer of complexity. with families spending years saving up land, money, livestock, and household items for their daughters. In medieval times, education was a privilege reserved for a tiny fraction of the population, mainly nobles, clergy, and the occasional merchant's child. About 95% of medieval teenagers received no formal education whatsoever. Instead, peasant teens learned through observation and practice. Ha ha ha, den beady medieval's. A farm boy would follow his father to the fields, learning how to plow, plant, and care for livestock. Girls shadowed their mothers, mastering cooking, cleaning, and managing a household. These skills were not taught in books. They were passed down through generations by doing. For a select few boys destined for religious life, monastery schools provided the closest thing to formal education, focusing heavily on Latin, basic mathematics, and theology. An even rarer opportunity existed for some girls in convents, where schools taught religious texts along with embroidery, basic medical care, and music. For most other teens, apprenticeships were the most common form of education. By age 12 or 13, many boys were sent to live with master craftsmen for 7 to 10 years to learn trades like blacksmithing or carpentry, receiving room, board, and training, but usually no wages. Teenage nobles received an education designed to prepare them for their future roles. Boys trained in Latin, mathematics, music, hunting, swordsmanship, and heraldry. Noble girls learned household management, basic literacy, music, dancing, and proper etiquette. Only about 2% of medieval teenagers received this level of education. Less than 0.1% of all medieval teenagers ever attended a university, which was the medieval equivalent of winning the lottery. In an era where each book was a handcrafted object that could cost as much as a small house, most teens never even saw one. Students often learned through dictation and memorization, and writing itself was a challenge. They used quill pens that needed constant resharpening, ink made from oat galls, and parchment made from animal skin. Mistakes meant starting over. While boys received more formal education, some girls from wealthy families did learn to read and write. Perhaps the most significant aspect of medieval education was how it reinforced social structures. As without access to it, a peasant teen had virtually no chance of rising above their station. Was de berukken verdriet in need. Razor you gee. Life for a medieval teenager was a constant battle against illness and injury. Getting sick was not just inconvenient, it was often deadly. A simple cut could lead to blood poisoning, while a common cold could progress to pneumonia with no antibiotics to fight it. The average medieval teen could expect to encounter at least 3 serious illnesses before reaching adulthood. A monastery record shows that out of a group of 20 novices, only 13 survived a single winter outbreak of what was likely influenza. Strangely, the plague seemed to hit older adults and young children the hardest, while many teenagers survived. Meanwhile, a disease called sweating sickness appeared particularly dangerous to healthy teens and young adults, with some village outbreaks killing nearly every victim between 14 and 21. Medieval medical care was a peculiar mix of practical knowledge, religious faith, and superstition. A wealthier teen might see a physician who would prescribe herbal remedies and bloodletting, a practice of deliberately cutting a patient to let blood flow out, which often made them weaker. Nutrition played a huge role in teen health. A peasant teen's grain-heavy diet often lacked sufficient protein and nutrients, leading to stunted growth. Dental health was particularly problematic. Without modern dental care, Many teens suffered from painful tooth decay and gum disease. By age 20, the average person had already lost several permanent teeth. A study of medieval skulls found that about 80% of individuals under 25 showed signs of significant dental decay. Then there were the everyday injuries. Farm teens risked cuts from scythes and kicks from horses. Teen apprentices suffered burns and mangled fingers. Noble teens were not exempt, with skeletons showing frequent fractures from horseback riding and weapons training. Yet archaeological evidence shows a remarkable resilience. Many teens who survived serious injuries, even compound fractures, went on to live normal lives, their bodies healing naturally, though often with significant scarring. Girls faced additional health challenges. With poor nutrition, the average age of first menstruation was around 15 to 16. For girls under 16, the risk of dying in childbirth was nearly 25%, a terrifying prospect for young brides. To protect themselves from illness, many carried pouches of herbs or wore plague amulets. Was Nizat, the Riti Tzdown, was birth wars, war. Life was not all work for medieval teenagers. Despite their hardships, they found creative ways to have fun. Medieval sports were nothing like today's organized games. Town football matches could involve hundreds of players from competing villages, with the only rule being to get the ball to your village's goal. Broken bones were so common that some towns banned the game, though teens usually ignored the bans. Wrestling matches were another favorite, a free-for-all where teenagers would gather in circles, and winners would stay in until defeated. A 15-year-old apprentice named Thomas Fuller once wrestled for 6 straight hours at a summer fair, beating 20 opponents before finally losing to his own master's son. Music and dancing played a huge role in teen social life. While nobles learned courtly dances, common teenagers invented their own moves at village festivals, creating elaborate group dances where partners switch constantly, a clever way to flirt without getting in trouble. Religious festivals offered rare chances to break social rules. During the Feast of Fools, teenagers could pretend to be priests or nobles for a day, a tradition that got so out of hand it was eventually banned in several towns. Taverns served as social hubs where teens gathered to share stories, play dice, and plot minor mischief. The streets and markets were the original hangout spots for sharing gossip and playing pranks, like dressing up as ghosts to scare travelers, or training a pig to run into the town square whenever the church bells rang. The leap from teenager to adult in medieval times was less a leap and more a sudden shove off a cliff. One day you were playing games, the next you were running a household or heading off to war. By age 14 you were expected to be found settled and hard at work. Take Thomas of Norwich, who at just 14 inherited his father's blacksmith shop. His diary shifts dramatically from complaints about his father's rules to worried calculations about iron costs. His first entry as an adult detailing his concerns about feeding his 5 younger siblings. Girls faced even more abrupt transitions. A 14-year-old merchant's daughter, through an arranged marriage, became the lady of her own household, her childhood trinkets replaced by the household keys she wore at her belt. The law itself treated 14 as a magical number. Boys could legally inherit property, sign contracts, and be held fully responsible for crimes. Girls could marry without parental consent, and both genders could be executed for serious offenses. Medieval medicine considered 14 the age when the body became fixed, and doctors would switch from gentle remedies to the full range of adult medicines, including vigorous bloodletting. Perhaps most striking were the emotional expectations. By 14, You were expected to have complete control over your feelings. Crying or showing fear were seen as childish behaviors to be abandoned. Despite these harsh expectations, secret diaries and letters show how teens maintain some aspects of childhood, passing notes and carving their names into castle walls. These small acts of rebellion showed that even in a world that demanded instant adulthood, the teenage spirit found ways to survive.